This episode was sponsored by the Geopolitical Insight and Education Foundation. Want to find out more? Check the link in our show notes.
Welcome to another episode of Legal for Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice. It's always Rosie here. And as I've said many times, this is just a group of students and young professionals who are very interested in anything that has to do with technology. And yes, it's regulation. So today I'm left lonely by Jack, who's not here. But I'm joined by a friend of the podcast who could, like, by now actually be the host because you've come like 5 times, Mark. So like, yeah, you're part of the family now. I'm
Yeah.
here with Dr. Mark Leiser. Great to see you.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Good to be back again and again and again and again and again.
It's an again, again, again. But like every time you come, you actually have some news. This is hilarious, I think, because
Yeah,
you always here in a different kind of suit.
different capacity. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Um,
yeah, do you think maybe it's time to share the news with our listeners?
well, yeah, I mean, it is a professional change in my life. I mean, I have always been an academic, and I have always, well, in most recent years, I've been affiliated with the Riga Graduate School of Law as a visiting professor. And I go out there a couple of years to teach courses and on the master's program. And it's been great because I get to travel to Riga in the Baltic states and meet a fantastic, very small community, but very passionate about digital technologies and the law, and very outside of the sort of Benelux bubble that I've operated in before. But after long, I wouldn't say bureaucratic, because but maybe that's the right word to use in this context. There was a very long process in Latvia to go through a sort of formal appointment. You have to be approved by the sort of expert science council or whatnot in order to be an academic out there. So I went through that process. But I've been appointed associate professor at the Riga Graduate School of Law, and I will be maintaining my kind of status quo teaching appointment and hopefully, well, on a tenure track as well. So just opens up a lot of possibilities for me, and it maintains my love for, as you know, objective discussions about the law and teaching, which I love doing.
Those students are going to be very lucky. So well,
Thank you.
I'm almost jealous. Yeah, of course, of course. Well, I hope you will still grant us the pleasure of your presence on this podcast, even if you now will be very busy with your students. And I hope that
I
they'll be
have
listening to the podcast as well.
I have a feeling our next podcast is going to be done person to person. I have a sneaking feeling that that's going to be the case.
I didn't give out too much news, otherwise
No,
all of our
no,
listeners are going to find out. No, I'm
no,
joking. They will find out soon.
yeah,
I hope. But anyways, there's also something else we have to talk about, which is something
yeah,
I've been reading that you have sent me, and I thought, well, it's a great occasion to talk about it on the pod.
yeah.
Also, your followers on LinkedIn will know more about this, so I will state the title of a working paper that we are going to discuss on this podcast. It's The Innovation Mandate, Making Europe's Digital Supervisory State Accountable for Rights, Growth, and Scale. It's a
Yes.
very, I would say, ambitious title, very lovely to state and to read.
Yeah.
Um, but let's start from the basics of this beautiful working paper. The title, yes. What is an innovation mandate? Why did you focus on this approach? Because I think it's a very kind of forward-looking way of seeing society and seeing supervision. So I would like to know what brought you to this idea and to define the innovation mandate, because I'm sure that
Sure.
not, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you raised a very important question, and background, I think, is context. For me, anybody that's been following my work over the past few years, I think that the way we approach big tech needs improvement. Obviously, I co-edited a book on critical perspectives on the GDPR. And over the last 18 months or so, in particular, I've spent a lot of time speaking to people who are not necessarily academics, not necessarily working lawyers, but people that work with data in their day-to-day job. So whether that's somebody that works in a research institute or somebody that works in science or somebody that works at a blood bank, a small and medium enterprises and or a small medium enterprise, and people that like or biotech, people that need to use data to advance human knowledge. And one of the things that really struck me was that um, our laws make it very difficult to use data, not necessarily to how do I phrase this? But what it tends to do is the costs associated using that data, whether that's time or people, actually hinders people's ability to actually use the data to advance human knowledge. So the rules can be seen to be burdensome, the compliance considerations, and because we have this kind of problem with the ambiguity and the lack of legal certainty with what is personal data, identifiability, how to use the data properly, people have been more protective for fear of some sort of enforcement decisions. And I think since 2016 um, to today, the narrative has been about, I think, confusing. There's people that don't like the excesses of big tech, that want the law and enforcement mechanisms to address those issues associated with big tech, but don't necessarily understand or appreciate that an enforcement in one context can be applicable in several others that have nothing to do with big tech. So a university wanting to reuse data for the purposes of curing a disease struggles with repurposing that data, or a lack of ambiguity or a lack of clarity about what data can you if somebody's consented for one use, does for one scientific experiment, and it reveals, oh, this data might cause another cure in another environment, do I have to go back and get consent again? Like, these are very confusing questions for people that aren't working with data every single day. And I think, well, it's not, I think the policy context has changed over those 10 years. We've had the Drahi and the Letta reports. We've had the competitiveness compass. We've had the startup and scale up strategy. We've had the AI continent action plan. And you have behind all of this various national DPAs that have taken different approaches to how you use personal data. And what all of that does is it hinders EU's competitive or the ability to scale up great projects and compete on the global scale. So this isn't me trying to come up with a solution to help big tech. It's actually trying to come up with a solution that helps every um, level of business so that they can move up and grow their businesses and in many ways better human society. So what I've tried to do is think throughout my career, what does proportionality look like? What does it mean to have a balanced approach to data protection? What does it mean to actually put Article 52 of the Charter into practice? And what I've been thinking is that when you take all of these concerns that are being voiced in all of these reports that I just mentioned, where we need to do something uh, to promote the European economy, to promote innovation, to promote technological deployment in the right environments. That we need our regulatory agencies, the supervisory actors, to think about the impact that their decisions are going to have on the economies at every level of the scale. So what I'm trying to produce or have come up with is a binding secondary meta duty on digital supervisors. So where they're exercising discretion, so the national DPAs and the EDPB and the EDPS, um, it mandates how they exercise that discretion, and it does not give firms a new right to innovate at the expense of fundamental rights. So the innovation mandate is um, a disclosure on how they took into consideration what they took into consideration to identify the rights and the risk, to disclose the evidence that they used, um, to disclose what assumptions they made about data deployment or technology deployment. Is there a less burdensome right preserving alternative to the one that they've proposed? And to ascertain whether or not there was legal certainty, whether it hindered entries into the global market, or did it hinder entry into the European market, which had a negative effect on our ability to compete on the global market. Does it hinder or constrain investment? Like sovereignty is a big buzzword that's being used now. Does the regulation or the application of the regulation hinder investment because there's a lack of legal certainty, or does it compromise the ability to scale up because the rules are not clear? And explain how you came to your decisions about proportionality when that was, the obligation, or there was two conflicting rights, how you actually tackled the proportionality requirement that might be obligated to look at when you have two competing rights. So I'll stop there to let you ask me any follow-up questions on this point.
No, I really liked the way you explained this kind of approach. So we are talking again, just to clarify with our listeners who may have not read, of course, the piece. We are
Yeah.
talking about supervisory authorities such as the EDPB, DPAs, the Air Office. So we're talking about, again, the supervisory authorities kind of created by the legislation.
Yeah.
Um, so what you are describing is a kind of a discontinuous interpretation of specific legislation whereby the legislator has an orientation in mind, and then the authority kind of goes in the opposite direction. And that's obviously confusing to the companies, probably to the right holder as well, and definitely to the society as a whole, because then we want a lot of innovation coming over and we want to become, sovereign IT Europe, the digital space of Europe, blah, blah, blah. And then do not have the infrastructure to do that because well, nobody wants to invest in Europe because it's too burdensome and stuff. So, in this context, why do you think that supervisory authorities tend to be much more right oriented? Someone would say, some other people would say less pragmatic, some other people would say too cautious into interpreting legislative stances. Is that because they really have the interest of the European citizen in mind? Is that because there are other political needs to satisfy? Why do you
Yeah.
think what's the reason behind this trajectory?
Yeah, to be very clear, I don't think that digital supervisors are anti-innovation by intention, right? What I claim is that the institutional architecture makes restrictive error less visible than permissive error. So the idea is that, somebody will go to a supervisor or a DPA and complain after they believe that their rights have been infringed. But what is not happening is a product designer going to the EDPB and saying, "Hey, I can't launch this product," and them saying, "Why not?" and having an engagement. I don't think there's a whole lot of engagement with people who are um, product managers and developers. So no one opens a case file at the DPA for a company that was never financed or a product that was never launched. So what our enforcement focuses tends to be on is complaints and judgments and identifiable victims. And then when you get an over restriction, then it creates a kind of dispersed delay and you get abandoned projects and foregone entry. And so when you have a lack of clarity and lack of certainty, which is, as you know, my position in the omnibus is that we need to fix the approach to personal data so that you have legal certainty, then that helps drive forward innovation because people are not going to over comply to the detriment of their economic growth of the union. So if you have legal certainty, and you have clarity about what the law means and what it should entail, then you get innovation because people know what they can do and what they can't do. So right now, we have open textured standards. We have fragmentation throughout the union because DPAs take their own approaches, and we have technical uncertainty. We don't have a lot of guidelines with clear technical standards about what you can and can't do. We don't know what necessity looks like. We don't really know what anonymization looks like. We have different tests for legitimate interests. We have different tests and understanding for explainability. And conservative proxies become administratively safer. So if we don't know what the rules are, we're err on the side of caution so that we don't face an enforcement action somewhat later. So those we have this kind of concept of let's release some guidelines, but that's soft law, but they have hard effects. Non-binding guidance becomes the practical benchmark for firms and auditors and investors and national authorities. And the market, on the other hand, needs an answer before the litigation cycle ends. Like we need to know what we can do to get this product out. And at the same time, we operate in regulatory silos. The DPAs look at the problem from a data protection point of view, the consumer protection people look at it from the average consumer point of view, the competition people look at it from their point of view, and do we have people competing in an open marketplace? And the firm at the heart of this bears all of these conflicts. Right? You have to not only comply with the AI Act, but the GDPR. You might have to comply with the e-privacy directive. You might have to apply with the DSA. You might have to apply with the DMA. And some of these are all in conflict with each other already. So because of these capacity gaps, because we have insufficient engineering, economics, and sectoral expertise, we don't really have lawyers even that can solve across the quagmire of the different rules that we have, then because there is a kind of regulatory uncertainty, we have over caution. And what that means in a market sense is that we end up relying on the incumbents, the big tech actors. So what I want to do is create a public law duty to make these authorities explain their decisions and the impact that they would have on innovation. And so, what that means, that doesn't mean that innovation gets a free ride. It simply means that some innovation should be constrained. A business model built on hidden externalities may deserve to, be reduced. But my question is whether the cost comes from a necessary protection, like, hey, we've got a real problem with the way that this product is going to affect the fundamental rights of European citizens, or whether, hey, that product can't go to market because we don't know how the rules would apply to it. Those are very different issues. And the innovation mandate, I think and hope, is to try and push regulators to think about the implication of what they're doing on the economy, which is the way our charter is actually set up in the first place.
I mean, that's a lovely perspective, but I feel like in some cases, especially, and I have to say, especially with the AI Act, which has been a pain for every type of firm, even thinking of using AI, like it's been really bad from the practice side, I would say. I mean, is the issue that the regulators aren't using, let's say, positions and laws well, or is the issue that they're not using it at all? Because I think with the AI Act, we've seen regulators being late at producing documentation, like literally late. They've had to postpone the date of enforcement of the most important, I would say, parts of the act because they were
Mhm.
late. And we've seen guidelines, and we were talking about this just right before the beginning of the recording, of course. We've seen
Yeah.
guidelines coming from the EDPB that yes, they are soft law. They are still going to be used as standards, but the lack of clarity in general in some of the points made by the guidelines make them very difficult to use. And because companies use them as hard law,
Mhm.
make them uncertain about coming to Europe. So is the issue really their approach, their perspective, the way the things are interpreted, or is the issue that, well, they're not strong enough and they're not capable enough, maybe in some cases, of
Yeah.
producing documentation that serves the purpose of the documentation itself?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. And what I'm really interested in is actually what are the consequences of whatever approach we're using is having on the market. So, I mean, there's clear evidence that there's negative post-GDPR effects on venture capital deal numbers and the amounts that people are willing to put forward. There are substantial firm level effects that identification, compliance, and enforcement are heterogeneous. We have evidence that there is a shift from radical incremental product innovation to safer things that can't really compete on the marketplace. We have also academic insights that tells us that privacy rules can alter the entry and the market structure. And if you think about the financing gap, the consequence of this is quite a substantial scaling up financing gap. So it doesn't prove necessarily GDPR causation, but it shows why what we're doing is creating uncertainty, and that uncertainty has knock-on effects. So we can talk about enforcement and the lack of enforcement, which seems to be a pretty common mantra these days, but fine totals and case counts don't actually and adequately measure whether a regulator is effective. And it's just a standalone issue that says, oh, well, we find, big tech 1 billion this year, right? That doesn't tell you whether everybody else is effectively being able to bring things to marketplace quickly. It doesn't tell you whether other companies that aren't subject to a large scale operation have been effectively enforced and have changed their behaviors. And all of the things that we know, like a non-binding guidelines, we tend to err on the side of caution, which then has a scaled down effect if those rules don't have clarity, if they don't operate with an amount of legal certainty, and people are worried about being the kind of next big bad actor that somebody is going to try and enforce against. So they over comply when they don't have to. So what I'm advocating for is actually something um, that I think it doesn't reduce fundamental rights, but it mandates that they take the impact that their actions are having on that ability to advance innovation or to advance technology or to advance AI. So it doesn't lower the rights floor at all. It simply creates a public duty on regulators to explain very openly and transparency. We know transparency is a buzzword that regulators should love. Why did you take that route as opposed when there was a uh, less burdensome route also available that would have achieved the same thing, right? That's one of the core elements of the innovation mandate is explanation of why you took a particular course of action. What evidence did you use? Because if you're using bad evidence to justify regulatory intervention, I think that's one of the reasons why we have such fragmentation and scaling down when it comes to innovation.
Oh, it's a very interesting approach, the one you're proposing, especially because, like, I mean, the explainability, like, of the public law explainability, and I'm
Yeah.
remembering my administrative law exam, which in Italian is diritto amministrativo, and I think everyone has cried over that at least once. But my point is that, I mean, we're talking about a specific test, a specific kind of standard that's applied to, for example, expropriations. So when the state is asking you to leave your house, for example, with compensation, it's a big ask that the state will do of you, and so that's why you need a very strong explanation behind it. So we are talking about something that touches the subject very much. Like we're talking about their property. And in this case, we're talking about a right to business, which is a fundamental right under the Charter, of course, but it's also something very close to, I would say, the general needs of society, as property is the right to do business is also very important. So yeah, it's a huge step, but also I feel it's fair to ask if the counterbalance to this ask is the right to business.
Well, it is and it isn't. And I want to be very clear about this because, contrary to what the way people present their information about data protection, is there is no general rule that data protection has lexicographic priority over Article 16 or every internal market objective. So, there has been, sometimes you hear like a narrative that comes out from people about how data protection where is that rooted in law? I don't believe it is, and I think that's a misinterpretation or maybe even disinformation about the way that our each EU charter operates. Article 52 creates the essence, the legality, the necessity, and the proportionality, and it requires structured reconciliation, not free form economic balancing. And when you look at all of the case law that comes out of the CJU, you have a fair balance line, you also have a hard floor line, and you also have Article 16, which is, I would say, is real. It's a real freedom, but it's also bounded. And so the case law gives us this is what you can't go below. This is what you have to do. And when you apply Article 16, it's a real freedom which applies in certain conditions and in a certain way. So it's not what the innovation does is or the innovation mandate, as I propose it does, is it recognizes that there is a fixed legal floor that you can't go below. It then, in very real terms, gives you a living, breathing proportionality method, right? We talk about proportionality as a kind of abstract, it has to be proportional. What does that look like? It is a method of ensuring proportionality in the way that Article 52 was designed to give us to competing fundamental rights. And then supervisors have to fill the administrative space above the fundamental rights floor. So this is the proportionality method, and these are the things that you have to do to ensure proportionality between not just data protection and Article 16, but this is how we concluded that this right, when we applied it in competition with this right, this is how we took those two things into consideration. So when data protection is in conflict with free expression, this is what we took into consideration when we resolved that conflict. And so that would be another form of proportionality method. So when you come across cases like Sabum or Google Spain, the innovation mandate can still be applicable to those supervisors that are having to task themselves with resolving competition or conflict between two competing rights. So when the court makes it very clear what that line is, that line in the sand that you can't go below, the mandate doesn't go beneath that, right? We recognize and we respect the floor for fundamental rights, but where the courts have to interpret that hey, there's two conflicts here. There's a conflict with business or there's a conflict with another fundamental right. Supervisors under a public law duty must justify the route that they went down. It's very simple. That's it in a nutshell, is that you don't get a free ride anymore. You have to explain why you took that choice, and then that choice can be tested to see whether there was a least burdensome route available, which is what we do in other areas of data protection anyway. Look at all the state surveillance cases, for example. Was there a least invasive way of ensuring liberty and security?
You did mention the floor being kind of set either by legislation, but of course, I mean, super important are the courts. Super
Yeah,
important is, of course, the CJU.
yeah,
Um, how does your theory kind of deal with the idea that these courts may set a floor that is going higher and higher and higher, kind of reaching up the ceiling, and the problem of innovation not being kind of an issue of supervisory authorities, but of
yeah.
courts that are over interpreting the legislation?
So if you look at the case law of the CJU, you have what I would say there's maybe 4 or 5 cases that you can look at which establish like a hard floor. Digital Rights Ireland, Tele2 and Watson, LQDN, Schrems 1 and Schrems 2. Like these are hardline cases or hard floor cases, right? Then you have the fair balance cases, Google Spain, Promiscua, Sheke and Eifer. And then you have Article 16 cases like Sky, Österreich, right? And what the court doesn't do is it doesn't design guidance, right? It looks at guidance to tell us whether or not, effective safeguards were put in place. So yes, there's been a fundamental or there's been an infringement of a fundamental right. Yes, that was proportional, or no, there wasn't any safeguards in place, or it was disproportionate to the objective that you were trying to achieve. So the court doesn't design that guidance. It doesn't design the evidence thresholds. It doesn't design the response times. It doesn't design or make sandboxes operate. It doesn't do cross-remedy coordination. The administrative choices that happen in those spaces, they're the ones that shape the investment before the litigation reaches Luxembourg. So when you're thinking about what the guidance looks like, the firms and the businesses working in the space comply with the guidance rather than create the enforcement dispute for judicial clarification. So the mandate creates the record that the courts need. What was the doctrine? What are the facts? What are the safeguards? What are the alternatives? What are the reasons? If the authority is permissive, which I think is what you were getting to, and the court later says no, the court and the legislation win. The lawful choice set narrows or closes. Then you reassess what that hard floor line looks like. If it's moved closer to the ceiling, to use your example, then the next time somebody comes with a conflict or guidance comes out, that the digital authorities still have to operate within the mandate. They still have to say, well, this is the reason that we complied. We adopted this as the hard floor line, and then we came up with our evidential tests, and this is what we asked people to consider when they were developing the rules that the court would then assess. So the mandate, the authority revises the guidance accordingly. The authority still does the enforcement practice. The mandate really only applies for clarity, transition, sequencing, monitoring, and remedy of proportionality. So the duty becomes symmetrical. Permissive routes need evidence. So if the authority was like, yes, you could do this, yes, you can do that, then you still need to provide evidence as to what, why did you go down the permissive route? Why did you choose this safeguard? Why did you require this level of monitoring as opposed to something more robust? And why did you come up with these sort of conditions to stop processing? Why did you not adopt a harder line to stopping processing? So it goes both ways. Like I don't want it to be seen as an outcome which only works for business. It's simply saying whatever the supervisory authority is doing, if you're going permissively, explain it, right? Well, we think that the risk of this type of processing is low. Evidence suggests that the harms are minuscule or, can be resolved by individualizing and resolving the harms for the single record rows, for example. So that's why we took this approach. But if it's high-risk processing, then this is the evidence that we use to say that this was high risk. These are the potential for harms, and these are the reasons that we went in that direction. So it's about explaining your course of action, which gives another layer of transparency, which also helps legal certainty. So it helps businesses understand what the rules are and how they would be applied in a given situation. And it also gives businesses, I think, a route to suggest, hey, this was overburdensome. Like this doesn't, the evidence that they used is flawed, or the evidence that they cited has been discredited. So we want to challenge that fair balance line that they have been using, or that evidential standard that they used in their guidance, because we feel that that evidence is flawed and it's a hindrance to developing our product or innovating our new technologies.
But aren't there consultations for that point precisely? Like, why aren't, like when EDPB publishes any guidelines, they first have a consultation, businesses can comment, they also have polls and groups to talk about things. Why
Sure.
do you think that's not enough? And I'm asking so that our listeners understand as
Yeah.
well.
Okay. So there are consultations, and there is a huge issue, I think, with um, private lobbying, whether that comes from civil society, big tech, and uh, that private lobbying, I would say, is asymmetrical, right? If you apply the innovation mandate as I've proposed it, it becomes a public evidence process, right? So it shows you what incumbents' access was like. It makes their access visible, and it gives competing expertise a route to challenge it. So you could have a public evidence register, which contains the studies that were used, the assumptions that were used, the technical materials that were used, the stakeholder submissions that were used, what evidence was contested, and the reasons for accepting or rejecting alternatives. Now, why I think this is important is if the guidance is non-binding, which the EDP guidance is non-binding as it stands, but it's adopted as the practical outcome of providing that guidance, and the innovation mandate is put into practice, then when there is a least burdensome route which achieves the same objectives, that group of businesses or those researchers working in science can say, hey, this really compromises our abilities to do scientific research. This is an alternative, less burdensome course of action, and we would like to challenge the approach that's been put forward by the EDPB because the evidence that's in the public register is flawed, or it's been discredited, or it's been technological advances have, there's new ways of encrypting data that were not taken into consideration that we could use, which means that their concern is no longer relevant for what we want to do and how we want to make it safe. So creating transparency, creating balanced participation, creating individual case firewalls, impact statements, compatibility notes, divergence logs, key performance indicators, all of these things become part of the thing that must be taken into consideration by the EDPB, the NPAs, or the DPAs, and they have to be more transparent about how they came to the decision. So you also create, I think, a balanced means of challenging when those decisions are burdensome and harm the overall economic interests or the research interest or the scientific interest and advancing a project in the European Union. So I think it's independent judgment plus public reasons. I think that becomes the constitutional settlement, not any sort of ministerial control, not unreviewed discretion. So we can't keep having, I don't think, this fragmentation that comes from various DPAs that might have a very particular political interest in maintaining the status quo that they have to be challenged as well. And this opens the route for entities and actors that have an interest in that to be able to do that. And it also opens up doors for civil society as well.
I'm gonna play the role of maybe a DPA of someone I've talked to. We've had someone on the podcast as well. A very important point that's made by DPA very, very often is that they are under-equipped, they are underfunded, there isn't enough money. They are also buried into having to comply with several different provisions. For example, GDPR, many authorities, one in Germany specifically, are experiencing over kind of over referral to authorities due to the massive use of chatbots. So they are also um, flooded with requests. Um, the mandate that you are proposing is really interesting. It sounds amazing from a business perspective, from a right perspective, from a court perspective, because maybe they would be much more able to then assess, compliance in the future. My question is, do DPAs, do authorities right now have the means to comply with this level of transparency? Because I'm thinking of a business that then says, well, I'm challenging this method. Do then DPAs have the means to challenge back, to show, to rerun studies? Like, with what money is this going to be implemented?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that it does is it actually strengthens DPA independence and it creates that certainty, but actually lowers their work because they're getting the evidence and they're having to think about the evidence themselves rather than doing the worst case scenario and building a policy from the worst case scenario up. So I think that you can integrate an innovation mandate in a way that creates a materiality threshold and it also has scalable templates. Um, I think that's the wrong way to think about it in one way because what you need to do is compare the obligation to be transparent about how you made your decision with the hidden bureaucracy that comes with uncertainty, duplication, delayed launches, fragmentation, and that if you think about a business that is in the Netherlands, for example, and they do have the resources to take evidence into consideration, to look at the standard that was used for encrypting health data in a blood bank or a biobank, for example, or how they would reuse data. And they come to a conclusion that that can scale across the European Union. So you don't really need to have a DPA with like maybe in Estonia or Latvia focused on doing its own independent because the lessons can scale up across the union that come from maybe more like the Canils of the world. But the Canils of the world, if they're making a decision, um, I don't think that they are listening to all the different stakeholders. I think they come at it from a data protection point of view, and that there's other stakeholders that have a voice, and even if that voice is listened to or ignored, that you explain why it was ignored. Right? I think that's what DPA should be doing all the time. Like I think that the adopting the least permissive route is a disservice to what the role of the DPA actually should be, because the DPA is via the GDPR meant to take into consideration other fundamental rights. And there needs to be proportionality and balancing in the application of the GDPR that's inherently and explicitly in the text of the GDPR itself. So the DPA that's not doing that already, I think, is actually in violation of the intention of the GDPR. Does that make sense?
Cool. Okay. Um, I'm still a little bit skeptical about the means. I understand the point of violation, and I understand that like the point that you're making basically is like, yes, it sounds like a bit extra, but technically it's already there. It's just like
Mhm.
the problem is that it's not being done right now.
Yeah.
Um, I'm still I'm I there is this issue about authorities
Let me
not being
let me
funded.
let me
So
let me rephrase it a little bit differently, right? So let's just take you back to high school, Rosie. I know that was only a couple of years for you. It was a few years for me, but it was a lot longer for me. But like when you're given a mathematical equation, there's two things that you have to do. You have to put in the right answer and you have to show your work, right? Because showing your work means that you can show that you didn't use a calculator, right? All the innovation mandate does is require DPAs to show their work. How did you come to the conclusion that you did? What evidence did you take into consideration in that decision-making process? What safeguards? Why did you choose those safeguards? And to me, that's what they should be doing all along, right? That's
oh,
something
oh,
that the GDPR required, and it's also the proper application of the EU Charter. But it also properly engages with the economic considerations under the first objective of the GDPR about the free movement of data around the European Union. It brings everything into context that you can use data to promote economic growth. You can use data to advance research projects and grow and innovate. And when a DPA has intervened, that it explains its decision and creates a legal duty to explain your decisions. I don't think that, oh, we don't have the resources to do that. That's your prior, that's like this isn't, I don't think it's doing anything that isn't already a mandate on regulators. I'm just actually trying to formalize it in a formal legal duty so that there is no
way to escape.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your example with maths, although our listeners know that maths isn't exactly my strength point.
It wasn't my strong
But
suit either, but
you named the equation and my eyes just popped out like
yeah.
God. No, but
2 + 2 = 4. How did you get there?
no clue. I did use a
Don't
calculator.
know. Yeah.
Um, No, but my point, which I would like to go back to one like very briefly, is
Yeah.
what you said, like this innovation mandate, and the right to have a public law explanation can be then deployed by companies, civil society, anyone that's acting within the GDPR regime to to help authorities reconsider their standpoints, which is
Mhm.
where I'm pointing the issue of means and money. Because yes, when I'm doing an equation, I'm gonna show my thinking process.
Yeah,
Usually, if it's wrong, my teacher, professor, whoever at high school would be, it's wrong, you don't pass the exam. And that's
sure.
it. But that's my point. Like I'm asking, do authorities have the means to then face the resulting effects of that transparency?
Well,
That's
yeah, I think that they will have the means because their task is actually going to change. Because I actually, well, as we go back to the original point of or the earlier point that I was making about legal certainty, when you have more legal certainty, you're not spending time trying to figure out how to do something, right? You're not engaging with the DPAs to go, can I do this? Or please, can I do this? Please, can I do that? And the resources, we all know that there's a resource problem, but maybe look at it differently. If a business has to do a data protection impact assessment, and they before they process personal data, and they have to think about the impact of data processing on data subjects before they. I get that. That's a constitutional settlement. That's a legal settlement that I can get behind. But why don't supervisors have to do that? Why do they not have to come up with supervisory impact statements? Why do businesses have to be transparent about, and place their names on a transparency register, but regulators don't have to show how they got to the conclusion that they did? How do they work across regulations? How do they ensure compatibility with other decisions that are coming out of the DPAs. Now, I think, and I'm pretty convinced by this, that if you identify conflicts before firms have to solve them privately, that actually reduces the workload on the DPA. If you have balanced key performance indicators, then you think about rights and service quality together, not about approval and fines and enforcement risks. You're thinking about how do I do something because I know what I can do because there's very clear guidance. So think of it as a second layer of guidance that can be applied across different sectors. If you are thinking about, for example, um, uh, to be very clear, like I'm not promoting a sort of safe harbor for businesses either. Like there is a rights floor here. So it's constitutive, not decorative. And that means that when somebody has the opportunity to do something which is innovative, which is clear, like innovation, market leading or entry level, that this gives that necessary legal certainty to those businesses that are in that area about how they can do it because the things that they considered, the evidence that they used, was taken into consideration, that they came up with a approach which was not burdensome, or that the approach was burdensome because it was proportionate to the level of risk that was there upon review. And you can also see who is trying to influence the regulator, which I think is sometimes an understated problem in the European Union, where businesses or civil society or maybe funded groups are trying to influence the narrative about like what I mean there is we're having this huge conversation about online safety, right? But at the same time, a lot of the money that's coming into online safety is coming from the religious far right. And I think that that's something that we're not openly discussing enough. Like, who's funding all of this narrative and what's the purpose of having this? Why is the religious right funding online safety? And where's that money coming from? And where is it going? And how's it trying to drive this narrative? And that's an example that I looked at the transparency register a while ago. Like, there's not a whole lot of requirements on people to explain where they're getting their funding models from or their funding from and how it applies to their different funding model. So what I'm concerned about is actually creating regulatory transparency so that their decisions are not like operating in a vacuum, that we know how they got there, we know what they took into consideration. And if somebody put into, led with evidence that a regulator looked at, which was flawed, that we could say, hey, you made your decision on this based on this evidence, which has been proven to be false. So the compliance guidance that you've put forward isn't proportionate to the risks that you've identified. So we'd like you to reconsider the regulatory steps that you're mandating on companies and maybe change that fair balance approach, but you can still maintain the hard rights floor.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the last question, and to do that, I will circle back to the title, which is the innovation mandate. Now, I think there has been a trajectory in general, followed by some kind of companies, very much big techs, that has been, let's say, described as being innovation washing, which is using the term innovation to justify specific behaviors, because the European Union is very interested in innovation right now. So they're more likely to accept, let's say, controversial behaviors. And we've seen that a lot with AI chatbots and LLMs in general.
Yeah.
Because you're advocating for something that should be the principle already, and is also called like transparency, explainability, these are systems and processes that are already put into practice in public law all around Europe. why did you choose the innovation mandate as a title when the transparency mandate or the explainability mandate or the right um, to a reason mandate would have been equally useful and equally well placed rather than and wouldn't have used the term innovation, which is, being complained about by a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I get that there's some people that are complaining about innovation. I also think that the policy context has changed. And going back to the sort of my opening remarks on this, is that for the first 10 years of the GDPR coming into effect and then becoming really landing in 2018. But maybe the narrative at that time, and I remember what it was like in 2018, that a lot of the narrative was, no, you can't do that, right? The GDPR prevents you from doing that, or that's against the law because GDPR, data protection or whatnot. And yeah, there was a lot of things that were happening back then, which I think were against the law and needed to be constrained and needed to bring under some sort of regulatory control. No problems with that. What we've had since then is a series of case law that sort of gives us multi layers, right? We have that hard is right floor, and then you have the fair balance test, and then you have different cases about competing fundamental rights and how you're meant to deal with that. But what we also have since that time period is the economic reality of data in the 21st century. And especially since 2020, I think that there has been a clear pushback from some of the people that want to create, that want to do research, that want to do science, that want to develop their business, that can't because the rules lack clarity, they lack uniform application, and because of the nuances of the European Union, have resulted in fragmentation. Now, I find that kind of ironic for a general regulation that we have fragmentation and we have DPAs that are applying the rules differently. And the most infamous example is the Dutch approach to legitimate interests, where they said, an economic interest isn't a legitimate interest. So you've got these extreme interpretations across the member states, or as a result of some member states. And at the same time, we have now the introduction of the next genre, which is the um, the datafication epic of um, the world in which we live in. So I often think about Andrew Murray's claims that there was a computerization phase, there was a digitization phase, there was convergence, and then there was datafication. And then beyond that, I think it's patternification. I probably made that word up, where you look for patterns in big data to try and learn insights and whatnot. And AI has given us lots of potential. Now, we've seen within the last couple of years massive advancements in AI and the deployment, good or bad, of various technologies that give us some opportunities to rethink and learn from the way that we have behaved and create new efficiencies and new products and whatnot. At the same time, there is also the political reality that we're trying to have a more sovereign approach to the European Union. Now, what is it that you need to have sovereign AI or sovereign big tech or sovereign data? You need startups. You need scale. You need infrastructure. You need laws that work and provide clarity. You need investment. And more importantly than all of that, you need companies who are willing to design products. So I think of this quite practically. I remember COVID when everybody was forced to go online, and there were all these different um, potential solutions to video conferencing. And everybody ended up just going to the big players because they couldn't get these small things to operate properly at scale for what they needed them to do. So we had different solutions, but they didn't scale up quick enough And then we ended up going back to things like Teams and Zoom anyway. And I think that that is a good example of, hey, even when we need something, we really struggle with deploying it at scale in the European Union. So innovation as a sort of generic term creates, I think, a narrative that says, okay, we have an opportunity to compete on the global marketplace by promoting European companies, promoting European ideas, promoting the European marketplace as being a marketplace that respects fundamental rights. But we can't do it if the rules regulating the deployment of those technologies are unclear, if they're ambiguous, if they hinder growth and development, especially when there's a more or less burdensome route to get there. So for me, when you're thinking about independent authority, right? Going back to your idea of DPAs and EDPB, and them being the kind of protectors of the fundamental right to data protection. Independent authority cannot mean opaque authority, right? Citizens, businesses need supervisors that are insulated from case-specific political or commercial pressure, and accountable for general market shaping choices. So if they tell people that you can't do something, they need to explain to people why you can't do something. If the reasoning for not doing something is flawed, then they need to be flexible enough to rethink as to why, or can we allow this thing to develop in a way which doesn't, that still protects fundamental rights, but also you create an absolute firewall case with clear transparency about what evidence you took into consideration, who you listened to, who you didn't listen to, why you thought this way, why you thought that way. Was the potential for economic growth, compatible with fundamental rights? Or did we have to protect fundamental rights first and then think about economic growth? And so the answer to unelected technical or technological power is not ministerial discretion and ambiguity. The answer to that is independent judgment exercised through transparent, contestable, and reviewable procedures. And the innovation mandate gives a real, I think, it brings to life the proportionality test that we all know, we learn about, but it's this abstract, ethereal thing that sits in the background. It creates a way of providing that proportionality method and making it clear to people about what you took into consideration. Like, we're not going to go there. This is a no-go area because we believe the harm was too great. And you explain it and you make it clear about why you took that course of action. But at the same time, the European Union is an economic entity. It is an economic center. It is promoting economic growth. That is written into the charter as well, alongside Article 16. And when you look at the considerations of things like Draghi and Letta and the stated aims and objectives of the Union, innovation is at the heart of that. So it's putting a duty to explain your choices onto the very people who are shaping that market.
Dr. Mark Leiser, thank you very much for this conversation. We will put the links to our show notes so that our listeners can find the innovation mandate very quickly and very easily. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and I really like this idea. So I hope that authorities will follow your guidance, I would say.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's always a pleasure to come and talk to you. And thank you very much for the really enlightening chat. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. This was all for the Legal for Tech, the podcast.
This episode was brought to you in partnership with DG Beetle. DG Beetle helps privacy professionals to stay up to date with the most important European documents in the AI, data and digital space every day. Curious to know more? Check out the link in our show notes.